Morning. I was waiting on him. The sound booth guy. Good to see all of you this morning. We hope you had a good week. Looking forward to spending some time together today. Open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. We are kind of this morning changing gears. Daniel chapter 1 through chapter 6 are narratives. They're stories about things that happened. Daniel and the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar living like a wild animal, the right hand writing on the wall. Beginning in chapter 7, going through the rest of the chapter, we get into apocalyptic figurative language of visions and dreams that are projecting or predicting the future. And anytime that happens, there's going to be, there is always some difference as to what people think the visions are referring to. If you do much listening to religious people, you know there are about 40 different ideas on what Revelation means. I had a teacher one time who said, if you want to understand Revelation, you want to understand the last part of Daniel, read one commentary. If you read two, you'll be completely confused because they will contradict one another. So there is a necessity going to be in these chapters. Some things are going to be kind of not going to be able to be dogmatic about exactly what they mean. My intent is to give you what I believe is the best interpretation of these visions based on study and scholarship and people that I've read. These are not my understanding as far as I didn't come up with them, but we're going to do the best that we can. In chapter 7, the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay on his bed. He wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. The first thing that is very interesting to me is chapter 7 chronologically actually happens between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Because chapter 5 is Belshazzar's last year in office. In fact, it's his last day in office. Chapter 7 is his first year. So chapter 7 through 12 are not written in chronological order. They will fall somewhere within, most of them within those 6 chapters. Chapter 7 belongs between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. The probability is the word great sea almost always in the Bible refers to the Mediterranean. Because that was the great body of water around where they were. So it was almost all the time when he said great sea, it's talking about Mediterranean. When he talks about the winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, agitation. We're going to be talking about 4 successive world powers. The picture that's drawn in chapter 7 is very similar to the picture that's drawn in chapter 2 of those 4 great world powers. And so when one empire replaces another one, there's generally a lot of agitation because there's war, there's infighting, there's all these kind of things. When you went from the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian, and the Medo-Persian to the Greek, from the Greek to the Roman, there had to be a battle or a war that did that. So you've got, over the period of these visions, you've got a lot of agitation, a lot of upheaval, a lot of battling. And so that's what this stirring up the winds on the sea is about. It's about causing a storm, causing agitation. And notice, I find it very interesting, he says the winds of heaven. Now the possibility is that very simply means wind, because wind's in what we call atmosphere or heaven. And the second possibility there, and I kind of lean toward this one, is the word heaven is a reference to God's dwelling place. And when it talks about the winds of heaven stirring up the sea, that means God's in control of this. God is the one who's doing this. It's not an accident that the Medo-Persian Empire followed the Babylonian Empire. It's not an accident that Rome came along when Rome came along. Those things were declared by God. And so that's what I think, the idea of the winds of heaven. The first was like a lion, had eagle's wings, and I looked as its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, And the mind of a man was given to it. It had 4 different beasts, not all at the same time. They're consecutive. And the first beast was like a lion. When you think of a lion, what do you think of? Strength, courage, carnivore, destroys animals to eat them. So that's kind of the picture you're getting here of this first kingdom. As we've noticed before, that was the Babylonian Empire. It was a lion. It had eagle's wings. What do eagle's wings signify? Speed, swiftness. Nebuchadnezzar took over the throne of Babylon in 606 BC. By about 560, or even a little bit before that, he had taken over the whole known world at that point in time. He'd already defeated Egypt. He'd already defeated Assyria. And so the kingdom moved very swiftly. Not only did it grow very swiftly, it also died very swiftly. 606, Nebuchadnezzar became emperor, became king. 536, the Babylonian Empire is done. 70 years, that's all it was. 606 to 536, gone. Not only does it swiftly arise, it swiftly declines. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, he was the kind of the power that kept that together. After his death, it really started to decline. And to me, when it looked, then as I looked, its wings were plucked off. What happens to an eagle whose wings are plucked off? Grounded, he can't fly. And so you're talking about the power of Babylon being kind of taken away from it. He was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. It goes being represented by a lion with eagle's wings, being represented by a man. And so the Babylonian Empire kind of just got weaker and weaker and finally just went away. Now there are some who think that phrase, and a man of a mind was given to it, is a reference back to Daniel chapter 4. But Nebuchadnezzar was made to live like a wild beast and he became a man. There's some who think that's what that is. I'm not quite sure about that. Verse 5, so that's the Babylonian Empire. Verse 5, behold another beast, the second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, arise, devour much flesh. Okay, what's a bear? What do you think of when you think of a bear?
Strong.
What?
Strong.
Strong. Courageous. One individual pointed out one of the differences between when you think of a lion, you think of a powerful animal, but you think of a graceful animal. You ever seen a lion run? I don't think of grace when I think of a bear. It's kind of lumbering, destructive, powerful. And so that's the idea. Physically stronger. It was raised up on one side. And we're talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire is made up by the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus was a Mede. When the empire first started, the Medes were stronger. Within about 30 or 40 years, that had reversed. The Persians became the stronger part of the empire. And so with the bear being raised up on one side, that's indicating that one side is more powerful than the other one. Persian Empire is more powerful than, or Persian part is more powerful than the Medes. 3 ribs in its mouth. What does that mean? Huh? Some people think it's a reference to 3 kingdoms. Medo-Persia defeated Lydia, they defeated Egypt, they defeated Babylon. That would be 3 kingdoms. The other possibility is, have you ever watched somebody eat who's really, really, really hungry? I'm convinced most of us don't know what real hunger is. But I watched a man one time eat a bologna sandwich in about 35 seconds. And one of the attributes of that was he had bologna in his mouth and he's biting on another part of the sandwich. He's still continuing to eat while he's got food in his mouth. The idea here may very well be this Medo-Persian Empire has destroyed countries to the point that they're still in his mouth, but he's still devouring. With ribs in his mouth, it says, arise and devour much flesh. He's already destroyed some, now he's going to destroy more. And so that continues to go. After this, I looked and behold another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird. Now remember, the first one had 2 wings. If 2 wings represent speed, what does 4 wings represent? More speed, ultra speed. Alexander the Great, Grecian Empire, became king of Greece in 334 BC. In 323 BC, which is 11 years later, Alexander the Great died after having conquered the entire known world. In fact, there's a legend that goes around, I don't know whether it's true or not, I've read it in several different places, that before he died, Alexander the Great actually sat down and cried because there were no more kingdoms to conquer. He'd already beat all of them. He conquered the entire world in less than 11 years. That's fast. Especially when you consider the fact he did it with horses and walking, not planes and tanks and all this modern day fast stuff we got nowadays. He had the 4 wings on his back, and the beast had 4 heads. What in the world does that mean? What happened to the Grecian Empire when Alexander the Great died? You're going to get a little bit of a history lesson here. And I think it's important to understand this vision. When Alexander the Great died, he had a wife who was pregnant with a child. Alexander the Great's kingdom was divided into 4 parts and given to 4 different his generals to keep in waiting for that child being born. Now the problem was, shortly after Alexander the Great died, one of those generals killed that woman and her unborn baby. And so Alexander the Great has no heirs. That kingdom was divided into 4 parts, and it stayed that way. Now, 2 of them, the Bible doesn't have to say much about. Antipater received the rule of Greece and Persia, Greece and Macedonia. Lysimachus got Thrace and Asia Minor. A general by the name of Seleucus got Egypt. And a general by the name, or got Syria, and a general by the name of Ptolemy, Ptolemy, got Greece. If you've ever heard of Cleopatra, Cleopatra was from the Ptolemy family, several hundred years after that. But those 2 names, Ptolemy and Seleucus, you need to write down somewhere. Because over the history of the nation of Judah, between Daniel and Matthew, Syria and Egypt, and those 2 ruling families are going to play a large part in the history of Judah. You're going to hear a great deal about the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, especially if you get, I don't know how many you've done, I didn't for a long time, but if you do a study of the Jews between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, what's called the Intertestament period, that is dominated by Greece, by Syria and Egypt. Syria was here, Egypt was here. When Syria and Egypt got in a battle, who do you think was caught in the middle? Israel's right here. If the Seleucids went after the Ptolemies, they had to go through Egypt, had to go through Israel. If the Ptolemies went after Seleucids, they had to go through Israel. So, caught right in the middle.
So, like, are the 4 heads of government?
Yeah, those 4 different, the kingdom of Greece was divided into 4 different parts. And so there are now 4 kingdoms represented by those 4 heads. And 2 of those we're not going to do a great deal with. But the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are vitally important in the history of Judah. In fact, one of the later chapters of Daniel, we'll get into that later, one of those later chapters of Daniel talks a great deal about the king of the north and the king of the south, which is the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And we'll look at that a little bit later. I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceeding strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before him and before it, and had 10 horns. Later on in the chapter, it talks again about this fourth great beast. And he talks about the fact that its nails or its claws were made of brass. Can you imagine? He talks about here stomping what was left with his feet. Can you imagine stomping something with brass feet? With brass claws? What kind of damage that would do? And iron teeth? This is a reference, of course, to the Roman Empire. The most dreadful thing in existence in 400 or 500 years of ancient history was the Roman army. Nobody wanted to deal with the Roman army. For years and years and years, they were undefeatable. They were indestructible. And they rampaged everywhere they went. They were probably, for its time, they were probably the most powerful army that has ever been. Now, later on, as you get later in Roman history, they end up being a problem. But as it first began, that's what we're looking at. And it devoured and broke in pieces. By the time Christ comes along, New Testament open, Rome was by that time pretty much a world power. Controlled almost all of the world. And it ended up being, for the spread of the church, ended up being a good thing. When we talked about the 4 empires in chapter 2, each empire contributed something to the time for the coming of the church. Babylon contributed the synagogue. There had never been a synagogue until Jews went into Babylon captivity. They went into Babylon captivity, had to have somewhere to worship, so they built synagogues. The synagogue was one of the major pushes for the spread of the church. Remember when Paul went to a new city, where'd he go? Went to synagogue. A ready-made audience. The Medo-Persian Empire contributed to law and order. We mentioned the fact the Medo-Persian Empire was the first government in existence where the king was not above the law. When the law was passed, the king had to obey it just like everybody else did. The Grecian Empire contributed to language. Greek was almost a nigh universal language by the time the first century rolled around. What's always been interesting to me is why wasn't a universal language Latin? Because by the first century, it wasn't the Grecian Empire, it was Latin. It was the Roman Empire. Why weren't they speaking Latin? The Roman government itself conducted their business in Latin. Common people in everyday language spoke Greek. Whether that was because of the beauty of the language or it was already accessible to them or what, I don't know. But it's always been interesting to me. The Roman Empire contributed great roads, great transportation, and the ability to communicate openly. And so each one of those 4 world empires contributed something that made the world ready for the coming of the church. Remember in the book of Galatians, Paul said Christ was born in due season, in due time. All of these things God did. God was in control of all this for the purpose of getting the world ready for the coming of Christ and for the coming of the church. This was not an accident. It had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. The biggest question of Daniel chapter 7 is, who is the little horn?
Antiochus Epiphanes.
What?
Antiochus Epiphanes.
I am going to... my intention is to finish this chapter, and then we'll go back and look at who. There are about 4 or 5 different ideas as to who this little horn is. I'm going to present all 4 or 5 of them, and I'm going to tell you what I think my opinion is, which is no more important than anybody else's. We will get there. So there were 10 horns. Horns represent power, represent authority. So the probability is the 10 horns is either representation of 10 governments or 10 kings. My belief is the reference to 10 kings, but that's my belief. And so you've got this vision, this thing comes up, and it's interesting. The first one was a leopard, second one was a bear, the third one was the third one was a leopard. The first one was a lion, second one was a bear, third one was a leopard. What's the fourth one? Anybody know? It's not compared to any beast. Different from all the other ones. There's no beast to compare it to, evidently. So you've got those four. Verse 9 has a look, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was like pure wool. The throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. Who's that? It's God. It's God. Who's the Ancient of Days? It's God. You look at it, he took his seat, his clothing was white as snow, that's purity or righteousness. The hair of his head was like pure wool, that's reference to age, or how long he'd been there. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were like burning fire. A stream of fire issued out and came from before him. 1,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Now, in this context, if you make this a reference to Judgment Day, to the final judgment, you're taking it out of context. That's not what this is a reference to. In the middle of this division, what this is a reference to is a judgment on that fourth world empire. On that fourth beast that he just talked about. Yeah. The idea of God being surrounded by fire and a fiery stream coming out of the throne. We need to make sure, I've talked about this a great deal and I'm going to continue to talk about it. We need to make sure we understand. We hear a lot today about God being full of love and God being mercy and God being kindness and God being compassion, all this stuff. When was the last time you heard somebody talk about a God of wrath? Or a God of justice? Or a God of judgment? We don't talk about that. We don't like that. It's not an enjoyable subject to talk about the wrath of God. It's an enjoyable subject to talk about the love of God, the compassion of God, and the mercy of God. But the same Bible that says God is a God of love says God is a God of justice. The same Bible that says God is a God of compassion says God is a God of wrath. And so we got to get all of that. And this is again that picture of God sitting in judgment on the Roman Empire, which by that time would have included all four of them. I looked then because the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and I looked, the beast was killed and its body totally destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now there is some question here about exactly what he's talking about. When he talks about the horn speaking and the beast was killed, that very simply is a reference to the fact that God destroyed the Roman Empire. God judged them guilty, and destroyed them. He wiped out the Roman Empire. Now, notice it says the rest of the beasts, that is the other three kings, the other three beasts he'd been talking about, their dominion was taken away. No, they didn't rule, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. What does that mean? What happened to the Babylonian Empire? The empire itself was destroyed. What happened to those people in that empire? They were assimilated. They were taken in to the Medo-Persian Empire. Same thing happened in the Medo-Persian Empire, Greece. Greece took in the Medo-Persian Empire. Rome took in the Grecian Empire. What happened when Rome was destroyed? What's the next world empire? On the earth, physically, there's not one. Rome was the last one. Until Rome was destroyed, world empires were gone. There were no more. So it seems to me that's the best understanding of that idea. The other three continue to live. They continue to live through Rome. When Rome was destroyed, they all were destroyed. Now, very quickly. Verse 13, I saw in the night vision, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. He came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Who's that? It's Christ. And it's a picture of Christ when he ascended back into heaven and God gave him the kingdom. Notice it does not say he got the kingdom on earth. Some people try to make this a reference to the 1,000-year reign. We'll be talking about some of that throughout this book. But that can't be it, because he appeared before the Ancient of Days. He came before the Ancient of Days, which means he came before God in heaven. And in heaven, God gave him a kingdom. That happened when Jesus ascended back to the Father and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, and God gave him rulership over his kingdom. That's what this is a reference to. And notice it says his kingdom is everlasting. Daniel chapter 2, remember the stone came out of the mountain. A kingdom that shall never be destroyed, an everlasting kingdom, a worldwide kingdom. All people, all nations, all languages should serve him. All nations. It shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Now, if you look back in history, every human nation, every human kingdom that's ever been created or started has one day fallen. I think maybe America might need to learn that lesson. This one, not going to be given to somebody else. There is no destruction of this eternal kingdom. There is no destruction of this never-ending kingdom. There is no removal of this king from his throne to put somebody else on it. This is eternal. And so you've got the vision of Daniel. And it's interesting, in chapter 2 and chapter 4, Daniel's interpreting somebody else's dream. And there in chapter 7, he's getting a dream that he doesn't understand. In fact, later on in the chapter, it's going to talk about some of that. So now he's gone from being the interpreter of dreams to the receiver of dreams. But that's the overall picture. Verses 15 to the end of the chapter go back and give some more detail about some of the things that happened. We're going to be looking at that next week. I don't have enough time to get into it this morning. That's what we'll be talking about next week. And so you've got the picture of Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon's the first kingdom. Medo-Persia's the second kingdom. Greece is the third kingdom. Rome is the fourth kingdom. Then comes the kingdom of Christ. 4 world empires, and then the church is established. And if you don't believe in the foreknowledge of God, how in the world do you explain chapter 7? How in the world do you understand God said over 500 years before it happened that there was going to be 4 world kingdoms, that those were going to be replaced by his kingdom? And there are other parts of the book of Daniel, we'll get into this as we go through, that get even more specific than that. I am intrigued. I am astonished. I am amazed at the book of Daniel. I mentioned we started this is my favorite book in the Old Testament. It's also the hardest for me to understand. And there are parts of it I still haven't figured out. And there are parts of it that what I consider to be the greatest Bible scholars in the world totally disagree on. You've heard me mention from time to time, I had one of my teachers when I was in college. In fact, he established a school I went to by the name of Rex Turner, Sr. Rex Turner made a lifelong study of the book of Daniel. I've got his commentary in my office, and I use it a great deal in this class. But his understanding of Daniel chapter 7 And I don't know whether you know him or not, but there's a man from Scotland whose name is Jim McGuigan, who is an amazing Bible scholar. His understanding of Daniel chapter 7, totally opposite of each other. And they're both great Bible minds. They're both conservative. They're both members of the church. They're both good Christians. But they came to completely different conclusions on what Daniel chapter 7 means. One of the issues that you have with Daniel chapter 7 is, I know what Isaiah 7:14 means, because Matthew 1 tells me. I know what Isaiah 53 means, because Acts 8 tells me. I know what some of those passages in the Old Testament prophesying the coming. Micah 4, we talk about Christ being born in Bethlehem, because the New Testament tells me. There is no inspired interpretation of Daniel chapter 7. Now does that mean we can't learn from it? No. I mean, we can't understand it somewhat? No. It just simply means we're going to come to some different conclusions. And it may very well be, and I'm just going to throw this out there and we'll talk about it later, it may very well be those people who think the biggest disagreement comes over who is the little horn. It may be that all of those are true. It may be that God's using that description to fit more than one king, because he's done that before. There are prophecies in the Old Testament that have a double fulfillment, refer to two different things. That may be the case, I don't know. We'll get more into that next week when we look at the rest, or get into the rest of Daniel chapter 7. Yes?
You know, when I asked you about the fiery flame,
Uh-huh.
and you said that was God.
Yep.
Okay. This is my question. Is in verse 11, the horn, is that God too?
No. That's the horn referring back to the little horn back in verse 8. The horn was speaking great things. In other words, the picture here is of this horn is an enemy of God. And he's speaking against God. We'll get more into that in the later of the chapter. And that's basically the reason why God brought him into judgment. When we think about God's judgment, we think about Judgment Day in the creation. God has been involved in judgment for a long time. Go read the Old Testament. All of those nations that God destroyed when the Israelites went into the land of Canaan, that was God's judgment. The northern kingdom was completely destroyed and went into Assyrian captivity. That was God's judgment. When the Israelites, the nation of Judah, went into Babylonian captivity, it was God's judgment. I believe, and you may think I'm wrong, and you can disagree with me all you want to, you can be wrong just like anybody else can be. I believe the destruction, the end of the Soviet Union was God's judgment. And I also believe if we continue in the direction we're going, that when our country ends, it's going to be God's judgment. These things don't happen by accident. God still runs this world. He's still in control of it. And you thumb your nose at him for so long, and he's going to say, I'm done. And I've been wondering this for the last 30 years. I'm wondering how close we're getting to the line. And there's a possibility we may have already crossed it. 70 or 80 years before the southern kingdom was ever carried into Babylonian captivity, God said, I'm done with you. For 60 or 70 years before the Assyrian Empire, or the northern kingdom was destroyed, God said, I'm done with you. Just because God said, I'm done with you, doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. It happens on God's timeline. And so, now that I've rode my hobby horse for a minute, anyone have a question or comment? Anything we've talked about this morning? Yes?
Early on in the chapter, it speaks of the great sea, or the sea, wind blowing on the sea. There's a reference in my Bible that points to Revelation 17:15, in which they also use in Revelation the symbolism of the sea or a great sea, meaning, and it gives the explanation in 17:15 that the sea is a reference to people or society.
that could very well be true. It talks about the beast coming up out of the sea. Where did the beast come from? That came from among people. Oh, that's very well. The only reason I mentioned the Great Sea is because almost always in Scripture, when it uses the phrase Great Sea, it's talking about the Mediterranean. And it may be a reference to the Mediterranean being a representation of these peoples or nations or kingdoms or whatever. I really do hope you enjoy this book as much as I do. I love the book of Daniel. And every time, this is one of those books, every time I read it, I figure out something I didn't get before. And the problem when I figure out something I didn't get before is that it throws into upheaval everything I thought before. Now I got to change my whole thought process. We will pick up with I think it's verse 15. Yeah, verse 15 of chapter 7 next Sunday morning.